out of the frying pan into the fire. Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost hook, cloak, pony, feud, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on until the sun began to sink westward, behind the mountains. The shadows fell across Bilbo's path, and he looked back. Then he looked forward and could see only ridges and slopes falling towards lowlands and plains, glimpsing occasionally between the trees. "Good heavens," he exclaimed, "I seem to have got right on the other side of the misty mountain, right on the edge of the land beyond. Where, oh where, can Gandalf and the dwarves have got to? I only hope to goodness that they are not still back there in the power of the goblins." He still wandered on, out of the little high valley, over its edge, and down the slopes beyond, but all the while very uncomfortable thoughts were growing inside him. He wondered whether he ought not, now that he had a magic ring, to go back into the horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was a duty that he must turn back, and he was very miserable he felt about it, when he heard voices. He stopped and listened. It didn't sound like goblins, so he crept forward carefully. He was on a stony path, winding downward with a rocky wall on the left hand. On the other side, the ground sloped away, where there were dells below the level of the path, overhung with bushes and low trees. On one of these dells under the bushes, people were talking. He crept still nearer, and suddenly he saw peering between two big boulders a head with a red hood on it. It was Balin doing lookout. He could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He was still got the ring on, for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant, and he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without noticing him. "I will give them all the surprise," he thought, and he gathered and crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell. Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels, and wondering and debating what they were going to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying that they could possibly not go on with their journey leaving Mr. Baggins in the hands of the goblins, without trying to find out if he was alive or dead, and without trying to rescue him. "After all, he is my friend," said the wizard, "and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness he had not lost him." The dwarves wanted to know why he had even been brought at all, why he could not stick to his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. "He had been more trouble than he is so far," said one. "If we had to go back now into those abominable tunnels to look for him, then drat him, I say." Gandalf answered angrily, "I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you help me to look for him, or I go and leave you here to get out of the mess as best you can yourself. If you can only find him again, you will thank me before all is over. Whatever do you want to do and drop him for, Dory?" You would have dropped him if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark, tripping up your feet and kicking you in the head. Then why didn't you pick him up again? Good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another. You nearly chopped off my head with Glendarin, and Thorin was stabbed here and there and everywhere with Orcust. All of a sudden you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we saw the goblins running back yelping. You shouted, 'Follow me, everybody,' and everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had, and there was no time to count, as you quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards and out of the lower door, and hit helter-skelter down here. And here we are, without a burglar, confuscate him." "And here's the burglar," said Bilbo, stepping out into the middle of them and slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped. Then they started with surprise and delight. Gandalf was astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the others. He called to Balin and told him that he thought of a lookout who let people walk right into them without warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal with the dwarves after it. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased at their praise that he just chuckled inside and said nothing whatever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, very carefully and quietly." Well, it was the first time that even a mouse had crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not been spotted, and I take off my hood to you," which he did. "Balin at your service," he said. "Your servant, Mr. Baggins," said Bilbo. Then they wanted to know all about his adventure, and after they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything, except for about finding the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition, and shuddered most appreciatively at his description of goblin. And then I couldn't think of any other question with him sitting beside me. So I asked, "What's I got in my pocket?" And he couldn't guess in 3 goes. So I said, "What about your promise? Show me out." But he came to kill me, and I ran. I fell over, and he missed me in the dark. Then I followed him, because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, and so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance, and I could not get by. So I jumped over him and escaped, and ran down to the gate. What about the guards? Weren't there any? Oh yes, lots of them, but I dodged them. I got struck in the door, which was only opened a crack, and lost lots of my buttons, he said sadly, looking at his torn clothes. But I squeezed through all right, and here I am. The dwarfs looked at him with quite a new respect when he talked about dodging guards, jumping over goblins, and squeezing through, as if it was not very difficult or very alarming. "What did I tell you?" said Gandalf, laughing. "Mr. Baggins has got more about him than you guess." He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his bushy eyebrows. As he said this, the hobbit wondered if he had guessed at the part of his tale that he had left out. Then he had the question of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all by now to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again and where they had all got to now. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once. So now he told Mr. Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in part of the mountain, but their main gate used to come out on a different pass, one more easy to travel by. So they had often caught people by night near their gates. Evidently, people had given up going that way, and the goblins must have opened a new entrance at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken, quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up to now. I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again, or soon there'll be no getting over the mountains at all. As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yells, he realized what had happened. In the flash which killed the goblins, they were grabbed him. He had nipped inside the crack, just as it snapped to. He followed after the drivers and prisoners right to the edge of the great hall, and he sat down and worked up the best magic he could use in the shadows. A very ticklish business it was, touch and go. But of course, Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments with fire and light. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks at Old Took's Midsummer Eve parties, as you may remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, so the goblins called the lower gate. When Bilbo lost his buttons, as a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with the part of the mountain. But it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnel and guide them to the right direction. They made them gates ages ago, partly for a way of escape if they needed one, partly as a way to get out into the lands beyond, where they still come in dark and do great damage. They guard it always. No one has ever managed to block it up. They will guard it doubly after us. He laughed. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a good deal, but they had killed the great goblin and many others besides, and they had all escaped, so they might be said to have had the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. "We must be getting on at once, now that we are a little rested. They will come out after us in hundreds when night comes on, and already shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we pass. We must be miles on before dusk, and then will be a bit of moon if it keeps fine, and that is lucky." Now that they minded the moon much, but it gave them a little light. They gave us a little light to steer by. "Oh yes," he said, to answer the more questions from the Hobbit. "You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning that we were captured. We've gone miles and miles and come down right through the heart of the mountain, and are now on the other side, quite a short cut. But we are not at the point to which our past would have brought us. We are too far to the north, and have some awkward country ahead, and we are still pretty high up. Let's go on." "I am dreadfully hungry," groaned Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not had a meal since the night before the last. Just think of that for a hobbit. His stomach felt all empty and loose, and his legs all wobbly, now that the excitement was over. "Can't help it," said Gandalf, "unless you'd like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony back in your luggage." "No, thank you," said Bilbo. "Well, very well then. We might just tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves." As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat, but the blackberries were still only in flower, and of course there were no nuts, not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit of sorrel, and then he drank from the small mountain stream that crossed the path. He ate 3 wild strawberries that they found on the bank, but it was not too much good. They still went on. The rough path disappeared. The bushes and long grasses between the boulders and patches of rabbit-cropped turf, and thyme and sage and marjoram and yellow rock cress all vanished, and they found themselves at the top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of the landslide. When they began to go down this, the rubbish and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon larger bits of split stone were chattering down and started other pieces below them slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounced off, crashing with a dust and noise. Before long the whole slope above them and below them was seeming to move, and they were sliding away, huddled after all together, in a fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking stones, slabs, and stones. It was the trees at the bottom that saved them. They slid into the edge of the climbing wood of pines that had stood right up to the mountain slope for deeper, darker forests of the valleys below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves into the lower branches. Some, like the little hobbit, got behind a tree for shelter from the onslaught of the rocks. Soon the danger was over. The slide had stopped, and the last faint crashes could be heard as the largest of the disturbed stones went bounding and spinning along the bracken and pine roots far below. "Well, that had got us on a bit, and even goblin tracking will have a job to come down here quietly." "I dare say," grumbled Bomber, "but they won't find it difficult to send stones bouncing down on our heads." The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy, and were rubbing their bruises and damaged legs and feet. "Nonsense! We are going to turn aside here in the path of the slide. We must be quick. Look at the light." The sun had long gone behind the mountains. Already the shadows were deepening about them. Though far away, the trees and the other black tops of those growing lower down, they could still see the evening lights on the plains beyond. They limped along now as fast as they were able down the gentle slopes of a pine forest in a slanting path leading steadily southwards. At times they were pushing through a sea of bracken with tall fronds raising right above the hobbit's head. At times they were marching along quiet over the floor of pine needles, and all the while the forest gloom got heavier and the forest silence deeper. There was no wind that evening to bring even a sea sighing into the branches of the trees. "Must we go any further?" asked Bilbo, when it was so dark that he could only see Thorin's beard waggling beside him, and so quiet that he could hear the dwarves breathing like a loud noise. "My toes are all bruised and bent, and my legs ache, and my stomach is waggling like an empty sack." "A bit further," said Gandalf. After what seemed ages further, they came suddenly to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up and shining into the clearing. Somehow it struck all of them as not at all a nice place, although there was nothing wrong to see. All of a sudden they heard a howl away down the hill, a long shuddering howl. It answered by another away in the right, and a good deal nearer to them, and then by foot not far away to the left. And it was the wolves howling at the moon, wolves gathering together. There was no wolves living near Baggins' hole at home, but he knew the noise. He had had it described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins, on the Took side, who had been a great traveler, used to imitate it to frighten him. So to hear out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much used against wolves, especially against the evil packs that lived under the shadows of the goblin-infested mountains. Over the edge of the wild, on the borders of the unknown, wolves of the sort smell keener than goblins, and do not need to see you to catch you. "What do we do? What shall we do?" he cried. "Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves," he said. And it began a proverb that, though we now say, "Out of the frying pan into the fire," in the same sort of uncomfortable situation. Up the trees, quick!" cried Gandalf, and then they ran to the trees at the edge of the gale, hunting for those that had branches fairly low or even were slender enough to swarm up. They found them as quick as ever they could, and you can guess, and up they were high as ever that they could trust the branches. We would have laughed from a safe distance if you had seen the dwarves sitting in the trees with their beards dangling down, like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Philly and Killy were at the top of the tall larch like an enormous Christmas tree. Dory, Nori, Ori, and Oin and Gloin were more comfortable in a huge pine with regular branches sticking out at an interval like spoked wheels. Bifur, Bofur, Bomber, and Thorn were in another. Dwarlin and Barlin were swarming up a tall, slender fir with few branches and were trying to find a place to sit in the granary at the topmost boughs. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree into which they could not climb. A large pine standing at the very edge of the gale. He was quite hidden in the boughs, though you could see his eyes gleaming in the moon as he peered out. And Bilbo, he could not get into any tree, and was scuttling from trunk to trunk, like a rabbit that had lost its hole and has a dog after it. "You've left the burglar behind again," said Nori to Dory, looking down. "I can't always be carrying burglars on my back," said Dory. "Down the tunnels and up trees. What do you think I am, a porter?" "He'll be eaten if we don't do something," said Thorn, for there are howls all around them now, getting nearer and nearer. "Dory," he called, for Dory was lowest in the easiest tree. "Be quick and give Mr. Baggins a hand up." Dory was a really decent fellow in spite of his grumbling. Poor Bilbo could not see his hand even when he was climbing down to the bottom branches and hung his arm down as far as he could. So Dory actually climbed out of the tree and let Bilbo scramble up and stand on his back. Just at the moment, the wolves trotted howling into the clearing. All of a sudden, there were hundreds of eyes looking at them. Still, Dory did not let Bilbo down. He waited till he clambered off his shoulders into the branches, and then he jumped for the branches himself. Only in time, a wolf snapped at his cloak as he swung up, and nearly got himself. In a minute, there was a whole pack of them yelping all around the trees and leaping at the trunk, their eyes blazing and tongues hanging out. Even the wild wargs, for so evil wolves over the edge of the world were named, cannot climb trees. For a time they were safe. Luckily it was warm and not windy. Trees are not very comfortable to sit in for long at any time, but in the cold and wind, while wolves are all around waiting for you, they can be perfectly miserable places. This gale in the ring of trees was evidently a meeting place of the wolves. More and more kept coming in. They left guard at the foot of the tree which Dory and Bilbo were, and they went shuffling around till they had smelt out every tree that had ever anyone in it. These they guarded too, while all the rest, hundreds and hundreds it seemed, went and sat in the great circle in the gale, and in the middle of the circle was a great grey wolf. He spoke to them in a dreadful language of the Wargs. Gandalf understood it. Bilbo did not, but it sounded terrible to him, as if their talk was about cruel and wicked things, as it was. Every now and then the wargs in the circle would answer the great chief altogether, and their dreadful clamor almost made the hobbit fall out of the pine tree. I will tell you what Gandalf heard, though Bilbo did not understand it. The wargs and the goblins often helped one another in wicked deeds. Goblins do not usually venture very far from the mountains, unless they are driven out and are looking for new homes, or are marching to war, which I am glad to say has not happened for a long while. But in those days, they had sometimes used to go on raids, especially to get food or slaves to work for them. They had often got the wargs to help and shared the plunder with them. Sometimes the red and the wolves, like men, do on horses. Now it seemed that the great goblin raid had been planned for that very night. The warg had come to meet the goblins, and the goblins were late. The reason, no doubt, was the death of the great goblin, and all the excitement caused by the dwarves and Bilbo and the wizard, for whom they were probably still hunting. In spite of the dangers of this far land, bold men had late been making their way back into it from the south, cutting down trees and building themselves places to live in among the more pleasant woods in the valley and along the river shores. There were many of them, and they were brave and well armed. And even the wargs dared not attack them if they were many together, or on a bright day. But now they had planned with the goblins' help to come by night upon some of the villages nearest the mountain. If their plan had been carried out, there would have been none left that next day. All would have been killed except the few goblins kept from the wolves and carried back as prisoners to their caves. This was dreadful talk to listen to, not only because of the brave woodmen and their wives and children, but also because of the danger which now threatened Gandalf and his friends. The wargs were angry and puzzled at finding them in this very meeting place, and thought they were friends of the woodmen, and come to spy on them, and would take news of their plans down into the valley. And then the goblins and wolves would have fight a terrible battle instead of capturing prisoners and devouring people waking suddenly from their sleep. So the wargs had no intention of going away and letting the people up the trees escape, at any rate not until morning. Long before that, they said, goblin soldiers would come down from the mountains, and the goblins would climb trees, cut them down. Now you can understand why Gandalf, listening to the growls and yelpings, began to be a dreadful afraid wizard, though he was, and to feel that they had a very bad place and not yet escaped at all. All the time he was not going to let them have it all their own way, though he could not do very much, stuck up in a tall tree with wolves all around in the ground below. He gathered the huge pine cones from the branches of the tree, and then set one alight with a bright blue fire, and threw it whirling down among the circles of the wolves. It struck one on the back, and immediately his shaggy coat caught fire. He was leaping to and fro, yelping horribly. Then came another and another, one in blue flames, one in red, another in green. They burst on the ground in the middle of the circle and went off in colored sparks and smoke. Especially a large one hit the chief wolf on the nose. He leaped in the air 10 feet and then rushed around and around the circle, biting and snapping even at the other wolves in his anger and fright. The dwarves and Bilbo shouted and cheered. The rage of the wolves was so terrible to see, and the commotion they made filled all the forest. Wolves are afraid of fire at all times, but this was a most horrible and uncanny fire. If a spark got in their coats, it stuck and burned into them, and unless they rolled over quick, they were soon all in flames. Very soon, all the gale around the forest was rolling over and over to put out the sparks in their backs, while those that were burned were running about howling and setting others alight, till their own friends chased them away, and they fled off down the slopes, crying and yammering and looking for water. "What if all this uproar in the forest tonight?" said the Lord of Eagles. He was sitting black in the moonlight on the top of the lonely pinnacle of rocks on the eastern edge of the mountains. "I hear wolf voices. Are the goblins and the mischief in the woods?" He swept up into the air, and immediately 2 of his guards from the rocks at either hand leapt up to follow him. They circled up into the sky and looked down upon the ring of the wargs, a tiny spot far below, but the eagles had keen eyes and could see small things at a great distance. The Lord of the Eagles of the Misty Mountains had eyes that could look at the sun unblinking, and see a rabbit moving on the ground, a mile below even in the moonlight. So though he could not see the people in the trees, he could make out the commotion among the wolves, and see tiny flashes of fire, and hear the howling and yelling come up faint from far beneath him. Also he could see the glint of moonlight on the goblin spears and helmets, so long lines of wicked folk creeping down the hillside from their gate and wound into the woods. Eagles are not kindly birds. Some are cowardly and cruel, but the ancient race of the northern mountain were the greatest of all birds. They were proud and strong and noble-hearted. They do not love goblins or fear them. When they took any notice of them at all, which was seldom, for they did not eat such creatures, they swooped on them and drove them shrieking back to their caves and stopped whatever wickedness they were doing. The goblins hated the eagles and feared them, though they could not reach their lofty seats or drive them from the mountains. Tonight the Lord of the Eagles was filled with curiosity to know what was afoot, so he summoned many other eagles with him, and they flew away from the mountains, and slowly circled ever round and round. They came down, 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 towards the ring of the wolves and the meeting place of the goblins. A very good thing to do. Dreadful things had been going on. The wolves had caught fire and fled into the forest and set it alight in several places. It was high summer, and the eastern side of the mountain had been little rain for some time. The yellowed bracken, fallen branches, and deep-piled pine needles here and there in dead trees were soon in flames. All around the clearing of the wargs fire was leaping, but the wolf guards did not leave the trees. Maddened and angry, they were leaping and howling around the trunks. and cursing the dwarves in their horrible language, and with tongues hanging out and their eyes shining as red and fierce as the flames. Then suddenly goblins came running up yelling. They thought a battle with the woodwind was going on, but they soon learned what had really happened. Some of them actually sat down and laughed. Others waved their spears and crashed their shafts against the trees. Goblins are not afraid of fire, and they soon had a plan which seemed to most of them amusing. Some got all the wolves together in packs. Some stacked fern brush around the tree trunks. Others rushed round and stamped and beat and stamped until nearly all the flames were put out. But they did not put out the fire nearest the trees where the dwarves were. That fire they fed with leaves and dead branches and bracken. Soon they had a ring of smoke and flame all around the dwarves, and a ring which they kept from spreading outwards. But it closed slowly in, turning the running fire which was licking the fuel piled on the trees. Smoke was in Bilbo's eyes. He could feel the heat of the flames, and though the neck reeked, he could see the goblins dancing round and round in a circle, like people round a midsummer bonfire. Outside a ring of dancing warriors with spears and axes stood wolves at a respective distance, watching and waiting. He could hear the goblins begin a horrible song. 15 birds and 5 fir trees. Their feathers were fanned in a fiery breeze. But funny little birds, they had no wings. Oh, what shall we do with these funny things? Roast them alive, or steal them in a pot. Fry them, boil them, eat them hot. And then he stopped and shouted, "Fly away, little birds, fly away if you can. Come down, little birds, or you will get roasted in your nest. Sing, sing, little birds, why don't you sing?" "Go away, little boys," shouted Gandalf in answer. "It isn't bird nesting time. Also, naughty little boys that play with fire get punished." He said it making them angry and to show them he was not frightened of them. Though, of course, he was, the wizard thought himself. But they took no notice and it went on singing. "Burn, burn, trees and fern, shrivel and scorch a fizzling torch. Tonight, to light the night for our delight, yea, hey. Bake and toast 'em, fry 'em and roast 'em, till beards blaze and eyes glaze, till hair smells and skin crack, fat melts and bones black, and cinder lie beneath the sky, so dwarves shall die, in light of the night for our delight. Yo, hey, ya, hurry, hey, yo, hoy." And with yo, hoy, the flames were under Gandalf's tree. In a moment it was spreading to the others. The bark caught fire, the lowest branches cracked. Then Gandalf climbed to the top of his tree, and sudden splendor flashed his wind like lightning, as he got ready to spring down from the high right among the spears of the goblins. That would have been the end of him, though he would probably have killed many of them as he came hurtling down like a thunderbolt, but he never leaped. Just at the moment, the Lord of the Eagles swept down from above, seizing him with his talons, and was gone. There was a howl of anger and surprise from the goblins. Loud cried the Lord of the Eagles, who Gandalf was now spoken. Back swept the great eagles that were with him. Then down came the big black shadows. The wolves yammered and gnashed their teeth, and the goblins yelled and stamped with rage. They flung their heavy weapons in the air in vain. Over them swooped the eagles, and dark rush of their beating wings smote them in the floor to drove them far away. Their talons tore at their face. Other birds flew to treetops and seized the dwarves, who were scrambling up now as far as even dared to go. Poor little Bilbo was very nearly left behind. He just managed to catch hold of Dory's leg as Dory was bore off last of all, and up they went above the turmoil of the burning, Bilbo swinging in the air with his arms nearly breaking. Now far below, the goblins and wolves were scattering far and wide in the woods. A few eagles were still circling and sweeping above the battleground. The flames about the trees sprang suddenly up to the highest branches. They went up in crackling fire, and the sun furious sparks and smoke. Bilbo had escaped only just in time. Soon the light of the burning was faint below, and the red twinkle of the black floor was high in the night, rising all the time in strong sweeping circles. Bilbo never forgot that the flight. He circled on Dory's ankles. He moaned, my arms, but Dory groaned, my poor legs, my poor legs. At the best of the times, heights made Bilbo giddy. He used to turn queer if he looked at the edge of quite a little cliff, and he had never liked ladders, let alone trees, never hanging to escape from wolves below. So you can imagine how his head swam now. And then he looked down between his dangling toes and saw the dark lands opening wide beneath him. touching here and there with the light of the moon on the hillside, rocks, or streams in the plain. The pale peaks of the mountains were coming near, and moonlit spikes of rock sticking out of black shadows. Summer or not, it seemed very cold. He shut his eyes and wondered if he could not hold it any longer. Then he imagined what would happen if he did not. He felt sick. The flight ended only just in time for him. Just before his arms gave way, he loosed Dory's ankles with a gasp and fell onto a rough platform of the eagle's aerie. Then he lay without speaking, and his thoughts was a mixture of surprise at being saved from the fire and the fear lest he fall off that narrow space into the deep shadows on either side. He was feeling very queer indeed in his head by the time after the dreadful adventure of the last 3 days. With next nothing to eat, he found himself saying aloud, "Now I know what a piece of bacon feels like when it's suddenly picked out of the pan on the floor and put back on the shelf." "No, you don't," he heard Dory saying, "because the bacon knows that it will get back in the pan sooner or later, and it has to be hoped we shan't. Also, eagles aren't forks." No, not a bit like storks. Forks, I mean," said Bilbo, sitting up. He looked anxiously at the eagles who were perched close by. He wondered what other nonsense he had been saying, and if the eagles would think it rude. You ought not to be rude to an eagle when you are only the size of a hobbit, and are up in his aerie at night. The eagles only sharpened their beaks on stone and trimmed their feathers and took no notice. Soon another eagle flew up. "The Lord of the Eagles bids you to bring your prisoners to the great shelf," he cried, and was off again. And soon the others seized Dory in his claws and flew away with him in the night, leaving Bilbo all alone. He had just strength to wonder what the message meant by prisoners, and he began to think of being torn apart for supper like a rabbit, when his own turn came. The eagle came back, seizing him in the talons by the back of his coat, and swooped off. This time he flew only a short way. Very soon Bilbo was laid down, trembling with fear, in a wide shelf of rock on the mountainside. There was no path down to it save by flying, and no path down off it except by jumping over a precipice. And he found all those sitting with their backs to the mountain wall. The Lord of the Eagles was there and was speaking to Gandalf. It seemed that Bilbo was not going to be eaten after all, and the wizard and the Eagle Lord appeared to know one another slightly, and even to be on friendly terms. As a matter of fact, Gandalf, who had often been in the mountains, had once rendered a service to the eagles and healed their lord from an arrow wound. So you see, prisoners had meant prisoners rescued from the goblins only, and not captives of the eagles. As Bilbo listened to the talk of Gandalf, he realized that at last they were going to escape really and truly from the dreadful mountains. He was discussing plans with the great eagle for carrying the dwarves and himself and Bilbo far away and setting them down well on their journey across the plains below. The Lord of the Eagles would not take them anywhere near where men lived. "They would shoot us with their great bows of yew," he said, "for they think we are not after their sheep." And at other times they would be right. "No, we are glad to cheat the goblins of their sport, and are glad to repay others our thanks to you. But we will not risk ourselves for dwarves in the southward plains." "Very well," said Gandalf, "take us as far as you will. We are already deeply obliged to you, but it was meantime we are famished with hunger." "I am nearly dead of it," said Bilbo in a weak little voice that nobody heard. "Then perhaps that can perhaps be mended," said the Lord of the Eagles. Later, as you might have seen in the bright fire on the shelf of the rock, the figures of the dwarves sat round it cooking and making a fine roasting smell. The eagles had brought up the dried brought for fuel, and had brought rabbits, hares, and small sheep. The dwarves managed all the preparations. Bilbo was too weak to help, and anyway he was not much at skinning rabbit or cutting up meat, being used to having it delivered by the butcher all ready to cook. Gandalf, too, was lying down after doing his part in setting the fire going, since Oin and Gloin had lost their tinder boxes. Dwarves had never taken to matches even yet. So even at the end of the adventures of the Misty Mountains. Soon Bilbo's stomach was feeling full and comfortable again, and he felt he could sleep contentedly, though he really would have liked a loaf of butter even better than bits of meat toasted on sticks. He slept curled up on the head of a rock more soundly than he had ever done in his feather bed in his own little hobbit hole at home. But all night he dreamed of his own house, and wandering in his sleep into the different rooms, looking for something that he could not find, nor remember what it looked like.